It was a mundane Tuesday afternoon when Eleanor Thompson's phone buzzed with a text message. She set down her gardening shears, wiped her soil-covered hands on her apron, and reached for the device. Seeing her daughter-in-law's name on the screen made her pause. Vanessa rarely contacted her directly. Usually, communication came through her son, Michael. "We're going to dinner with my mom this Friday." The message read, "You should come. It'll be nice to spend some time together." Eleanor stared at the words, a mixture of surprise and wariness washing over her. There was no mention of a special occasion or celebration, just dinner. Her relationship with Vanessa had always been polite but never warm. They exchanged compliments at family gatherings, smiled for photos, and discussed safe topics like the weather or new recipes. Pleasant enough on the surface, but Eleanor always felt an invisible barrier she couldn't cross. An olive branch, perhaps, she wondered aloud to her empty kitchen, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Her cat, Milo, blinked lazily from his perch on the windowsill. She typed and deleted several responses before settling on a simple, "I'd love to." "What time?" Vanessa's reply came quickly, a thumbs-up emoji, and the restaurant details. No smiley face, no extra words, just a small, neutral gesture that left Eleanor wondering about her true intentions. For the next few days, Eleanor oscillated between anticipation and anxiety. She sorted through her wardrobe multiple times, unsure whether to dress up or go casual. "What does one wear to bridge a gap?" she asked Milo, who offered no sartorial advice. In the end, she settled on something in between a navy blue blouse with a simple silver necklace and well-tailored black slacks. Presentable, but not trying too hard. As she drove to the restaurant Friday evening, Eleanor rehearsed potential conversation topics: her garden's latest bloom, Michael's recent promotion, the book club she'd joined, anything to fill potential awkward silences. She arrived 10 minutes early, a habit from her teaching days that she'd never shaken, and sat in her car, taking deep breaths to steady her nerves. "It's just dinner," she reminded herself. How bad could it be? The restaurant was one of those upscale establishments with valet parking, dim lighting, and leather booths. Waiters glided across the floor as if on silent wheels. Eleanor spotted Michael waving from a corner table as soon as she entered. His smile, so like his father's, instantly warmed her heart. Vanessa sat beside him, elegant in a burgundy dress, her dark hair styled in loose waves. Across from her was a woman who could only be her mother, impeccably dressed with perfectly highlighted hair and jewelry that caught the light as she moved. She stood to greet Eleanor, her smile wide but calculating. "So, this is the famous mother," she said, her tone making Eleanor wonder if it was meant as a compliment or something else entirely. "Victoria Henderson. It's about time we met properly." Eleanor smiled politely and took the empty seat beside Victoria. "Eleanor Thompson. It's nice to meet you too." They ordered drinks, a scotch for Michael, wine for the women, and the conversation began with innocuous small talk about the menu and the unseasonably warm weather. At first, everything seemed normal, but there was something about Victoria's voice that made Eleanor feel like she was under a spotlight. "So, Eleanor," Victoria began after their drinks arrived, "Michael tells me you were a high school English teacher before retiring. What made you choose that career path?" "I've always loved literature," Eleanor replied, relaxing slightly at the familiar topic. "Helping young people discover great books felt worthwhile." Victoria nodded. "How noble. I was in real estate myself, the luxury market. Very challenging, but the commissions made it worthwhile." She emphasized the last word with a slight smile. "And now how do you fill your days?" "I keep busy," Eleanor said. "I volunteer at the library, tend to my garden, and I've recently joined a book club." "A garden, how lovely," Victoria's eyes gleamed. "What kind of garden?" "Mostly flowers, though I've started growing some herbs and vegetables too." Victoria glanced at her daughter, a knowing look passing between them that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "Well, that makes sense," Victoria said with a light laugh. "Gardening is the perfect hobby for people who don't like to go out much or who don't have many friends to spend time with." The comment landed like a slap. Eleanor's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and she felt her cheeks flush. From the corner of her eye, she saw Michael shift uncomfortably in his seat, but he remained silent. I find gardening quite social, actually, Eleanor managed, keeping her voice even. There's a whole community of gardeners in my neighborhood. We exchange plants and advice. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. Oh, I was just kidding. You know how it is, but Eleanor didn't know how it was. The evening had barely begun, and already she felt off balance, as if she'd stepped onto a stage without knowing her lines. As their appetizers arrived, Eleanor tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground. Michael mentioned you're planning a trip to Europe this summer. Vanessa, that sounds exciting. Vanessa brightened. Yes, Mom and I are doing a 2-week tour of France and Italy. We've been planning it for months. I've always wanted to visit Tuscany, Eleanor said, genuinely interested. The art, the architecture. You've never been to Europe, Victoria interrupted, eyebrows raised. Oh, you must go before you get too old to enjoy it properly. The walking alone can be exhausting for someone. She paused, her eyes traveling over Eleanor. Someone not accustomed to much physical activity. Again, that strange mix of concern and condescension. Eleanor took a sip of her wine, buying time to compose herself. I'm actually quite active, she said finally. I walk 3 miles most mornings. Good for you, Victoria said, as if praising a child for tying their shoes. It's important to stay mobile at your age. Eleanor was only 5 years older than Victoria. Michael finally spoke up. Mom's in better shape than I am, he said with a forced laugh. She helped me move furniture last month, and I was the one sore the next day. The conversation drifted to Michael's job. He worked as a software engineer at a growing tech company, recently promoted to team lead. As he described a challenging project, Eleanor felt a surge of pride. He'd always been bright, even as a child, solving puzzles that stumped his friends. It sounds like you're doing well, she said warmly. Victoria tilted her head. You must get your analytical skills from your father's side, she said to Michael. I imagine literature teachers aren't particularly numbers-oriented. Before Eleanor could respond, the waiter arrived with their main courses. The momentary interruption allowed her to take a deep breath and remind herself why she was here to support her son and hopefully improve her relationship with his wife. She could endure a few backhanded comments for that. As they began eating, Victoria asked about Eleanor's hobbies beyond gardening. I enjoy reading, Eleanor said. I'm currently making my way through the classics I never had time for when I was teaching, and I've taken up watercolor painting, though I'm still a beginner. Victoria nodded, cutting into her steak with precise movements. Ah, so you live through other people's lives, she said. That explains a lot. Eleanor's fork paused mid-air. I'm not sure what you mean. Books, Victoria clarified, though her tone suggested she meant something else. Living vicariously through fictional characters. It's a safe way to experience life, isn't it? Michael tensed beside his wife. Vanessa sipped her wine, her expression neutral, but her eyes flicked between her mother and mother-in-law with quiet interest. I wouldn't describe it that way, Eleanor said carefully. Reading broadens perspectives. It's not about avoiding real life. Of course, Victoria said, not conceding the point. Do you read much, Michael? Michael cleared his throat. Not as much as I should. Probably. Work keeps me busy. But you used to love reading, Eleanor said, remembering the boy who'd devoured science fiction novels under his covers with a flashlight. Remember how you couldn't put down those Robert Heinlein books? Yeah, that was a long time ago, he said, not meeting her eyes. Victoria turned the conversation to Michael's childhood, asking Eleanor about his early years. What seemed like innocent curiosity soon revealed itself as another avenue for subtle digs. It must have been difficult raising him alone after the divorce, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Children need stability, don't they? We managed quite well, Eleanor said firmly. Michael never wanted for anything. Except a father figure, Victoria added. The table fell silent. Even Vanessa looked uncomfortable now. My father was still in my life, Michael said quietly. He just didn't live with us. Victoria smiled. Of course, dear. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. But the damage was done. The memory of those difficult years after the divorce, the late nights Eleanor had spent grading papers while Michael slept, the birthday parties she'd organized alone, the constant financial worries all came rushing back. Mom's traditions are special, Michael continued, his voice stronger now. Her Christmas cookies are still the best I've ever had. The house always smelled amazing during the holidays. Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude for this small defense. How nice, Victoria said with a thin smile. I suppose when you don't have much else going on, you find ways to fill the time. Eleanor's chest tightened. The words were casual enough, but the tone was unmistakable. There was no humor in it, just a jab disguised as a joke. Baking is something I enjoy, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the heat rising to her face. It's not about filling time. Victoria took another sip of wine and waved her hand dismissively. Oh, I was just kidding. You take things so seriously. It was the perfect trap, make a hurtful comment, then act as if the other person was too sensitive for noticing. Dessert arrived, a delicate chocolate mousse for Victoria and Vanessa, and berry sorbet for Eleanor and Michael. As they ate, Victoria launched into a story about a friend who was having trouble keeping up with the times. Some people just don't adapt, she said, looking directly at Eleanor. They get stuck in their ways and then wonder why they get left behind. Vanessa laughed softly, her eyes fixed on her plate. Eleanor felt the weight of her gaze, though Vanessa never quite met her eyes. Do you think that's true? Eleanor, Victoria pressed. That some people resist change. I think change is inevitable, Eleanor replied carefully. But there's also value in tradition and consistency. Not everything needs to be reinvented. Victoria's lips pursed. That sounds like something someone resistant to change would say. Michael set down his spoon a bit too forcefully. Mom embraces plenty of change. She was one of the first teachers at her school to incorporate technology in the classroom. Right, Mom? Eleanor nodded, grateful for the lifeline. Yes, I actually led workshops on digital literacy for the other faculty members. Well, that's certainly surprising, Victoria said. Good for you. As the dessert plates were cleared, Eleanor found herself counting the minutes until she could politely leave. The evening had been a minefield of subtle insults and backhanded compliments, each one leaving her more exhausted than the last. The waiter brought the bill, placing it in the center of the table. Michael reached for it, but Victoria pushed it toward him with a smile. You're the man at the table, aren't you? She said lightly, but there was an edge to her words. Michael didn't laugh. He simply took the bill, glanced at it, and placed his card inside without comment. As the waiter walked away, Victoria leaned back in her chair, swirling the last of her wine. Well, she said, I suppose we can call this a successful evening. No one's walked out yet, so that's something. Michael's eyes met Eleanor's, and in that brief look, she saw exhaustion, an unspoken apology, and perhaps a hint of guilt. When they stood to leave, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the ordeal was nearly over, and sadness that what could have been a chance to strengthen family bonds had instead left her feeling more isolated than before. In the restaurant lobby, Eleanor was already envisioning the comfort of her quiet home when Vanessa made one final comment. If you don't like my mom's sarcastic jokes, she said with a light laugh, gesturing to Victoria, next time you can just pay the bill and leave. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge wrapped in a casual suggestion. Michael's head snapped toward his wife, his eyes wide with disbelief. Eleanor took a deep breath. I'll keep that in mind, she said quietly. Victoria laughed. Oh, she's just being silly. Eleanor understands humor, don't you? But as they stepped into the cool night air, Eleanor knew this wasn't about humor at all. A line had been crossed, and from that moment on, things would never be the same. The drive home passed in a blur. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind replaying every interaction, every loaded comment, every dismissive laugh. By the time she pulled into her driveway, her neck and shoulders ached with tension. Inside, she kicked off her shoes and sank onto her living room sofa. Milo immediately jumped into her lap, purring as if sensing her distress. Well, that was a disaster, she told the cat. scratching behind his ears. So much for building bridges. What troubled Eleanor most wasn't Victoria's behavior. Some people were simply mean-spirited, but Vanessa's participation. She hadn't openly insulted Eleanor, but her silent approval, her occasional smirk, her final comment about paying the bill, those spoke volumes, and Michael, caught in the middle, had seemed paralyzed, offering only token defenses. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Michael's name flashed on the screen. "Hello?" she answered, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Mom, did you get home okay?" He sounded tired, his words slightly rushed. "Yes, just now. Is everything all right?" A pause. I wanted to apologize. For tonight. I didn't know it would go like that." Eleanor closed her eyes. "It's okay, Michael. It wasn't your fault." "No, it wasn't okay," he said, his voice stronger now. "The things Victoria said to you. And Vanessa, I should have said something sooner." "You did say something," Eleanor reminded him, though they both knew his few comments had been too little, too late. "Not enough," he admitted. I didn't expect them to act that way." There was something in his tone confusion, disappointment that made Eleanor's heart ache. This was her son, her kind, intelligent son who'd always tried to see the best in people. She didn't want to burden him with her hurt feelings. "It's forgotten," she lied. "Really, Michael, don't worry about it." Another pause. "Are you sure? Because I can talk to Vanessa." "Please don't," Eleanor said quickly. "It would only make things awkward. Let's just move past it." After they hung up, Eleanor sat in the quiet of her living room, Milo still purring in her lap. She'd told Michael not to worry, but the truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa's parting words. "If you don't like my mom's sarcastic jokes, you can pay the bill and leave." It wasn't just the rudeness of it. It was the dismissal as if Eleanor's feelings didn't matter, as if she should either endure the insults or remove herself from their presence, as if she were an inconvenience rather than family. "That's not how family treats each other," she told Milo softly. "That's not how anyone should treat anyone." Eleanor had spent her career teaching teenagers about empathy through literature, helping them understand different perspectives, recognize the humanity in others. How strange that at 60, she found herself on the receiving end of such casual cruelty from adults who should know better. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor made a quiet decision. She wouldn't cut Michael out of her life, she could never do that, but she would be more careful about putting herself in situations where her dignity was at risk. If Vanessa and her mother couldn't show basic respect, Eleanor wouldn't expose herself to their behavior again. What she didn't know then was that this decision, this small act of self-protection, would set in motion a series of events that would force everyone to confront the dynamics that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. The dinner had been uncomfortable, but it was only the beginning. A week passed before Eleanor heard from Michael again. When her phone rang on a peaceful Tuesday morning, she was in the middle of pruning her roses, the sun warm on her back and the fragrance of blooms filling the air. "Mom, are you busy Saturday?" Michael sounded hesitant, almost apprehensive. "Nothing that can't be rescheduled," she replied, setting down her gardening shears. "Why, Vanessa and I were hoping you might come over for lunch. Just us three," he added quickly. "Victoria won't be there." Eleanor paused, her free hand absently stroking a velvet rose petal. After the disastrous dinner, she'd been mentally preparing herself for some distance, some cooling-off period. This invitation caught her off guard. "That sounds nice," she said finally, deciding to give them the benefit of the doubt. "What time at Ame?" When Saturday arrived, Eleanor drove to their suburban home with a mixture of hope and wariness. She'd brought a small potted orchid as a gift neutral. Elegant, appropriate. The sort of thing you bring to an uncertain social occasion. Michael greeted her at the door with a warm hug that lasted a beat longer than usual, as if trying to erase the tension of their last meeting through physical contact alone. Vanessa stood a few feet behind him in the hallway, her smile polite but guarded. "Something smells wonderful," Eleanor said, stepping inside and handing the orchid to Vanessa. "Thank you. It's beautiful," Vanessa said, examining the delicate white blooms. "Michael's making his famous roast chicken. I just helped with the sides. The house was immaculate as always. Everything in its place." Eleanor had always admired Vanessa's eye for design, the way she could make a space feel both elegant and inviting, if only that warmth extended to their relationship. In the kitchen, Michael busied himself with final preparations while Eleanor and Vanessa sat at the island counter, making small talk about the weather and local events. For a while, everything felt normal, pleasant. Even, they discussed a new shop that had opened downtown, a movie Vanessa had recently seen, an upcoming charity event at the community center. When they moved to the dining room, the conversation continued to flow easily. The food was delicious, and Eleanor began to relax. Maybe the dinner with Victoria had been an anomaly. Maybe this was a genuine attempt to reset their relationship. Then, as Michael went to the kitchen to get dessert, Vanessa leaned forward, her expression shifting subtly. "So, Eleanor," she began, her tone light, but with an undercurrent that immediately put Eleanor on guard. "Have you been dating anyone since your divorce? It's been, 15 years now?" The question came so unexpectedly that Eleanor nearly choked on her water. "No," she managed after a moment. "I haven't met anyone who... well, it just hasn't happened." Vanessa nodded, a look of exaggerated understanding on her face. "That's understandable. It must be hard to meet people at your age. How do you spend your evenings? Do you ever get lonely in that big house all by yourself?" Eleanor felt her face flush. The questions ventured far into personal territory, and something in Vanessa's tone felt less like genuine concern and more like curiosity tinged with judgment. "I keep busy," Eleanor said carefully. "I have friends, my book club, my projects." "Well, at least you have your baking and your plants," Vanessa interrupted with a little laugh. "That's something. Not everyone your age has hobbies to keep them busy." The words were delivered with that same casual smile Eleanor had seen at dinner, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't just a reference to Victoria's comments. Vanessa was making them her own. "I mean, it's really sweet," she continued, seemingly oblivious to Eleanor's discomfort. "How you've built a nice little life for yourself. You don't need much to be happy." Eleanor's throat tightened. The condescension was barely veiled. The implication clear her life was small, insignificant, worthy of pity rather than respect. Before she could formulate a response, Michael returned with a homemade apple tart. He took one look at Eleanor's face, then at his wife's, and his expression darkened. "Why would you say that?" he asked Vanessa, his voice quiet but sharp. Vanessa looked up, surprised at his tone. "Say what I'm just making conversation." She smiled disarmingly. "You know, joking around like Mom does." Michael set the dessert down with more force than necessary. "We saw how that ended last time. Do you really think that's a good idea?" The air in the room seemed to still. Vanessa glanced at Eleanor, perhaps expecting her to smooth things over, but Eleanor remained silent. For once, she wanted Vanessa to sit with the discomfort, to feel the weight of her own words. "I didn't mean anything by it," Vanessa said, reaching for her water glass, her smile faltering slightly. Michael didn't respond right away. He simply looked at his wife, and in that silence, the message was clear he wasn't going to pretend this was harmless anymore. The rest of the meal passed in awkward fits and starts of conversation. Michael asked Eleanor about her garden, and she answered, grateful for the safer topic. Vanessa contributed occasionally, her comments noticeably more measured, almost cautious. When it was time for Eleanor to leave, Michael walked her to the door. He paused for a moment, his voice low. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have stepped in sooner last time." "It's okay," Eleanor told him, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. What mattered was that he had spoken up now, and that meant more to her than he probably realized. As she drove away, Eleanor reflected on how quickly the dynamic had shifted when Michael refused to play along. The joke that had crossed a line had done more than just sting it, had drawn a line in the sand. She wondered if Vanessa truly didn't see the harm in her words, or if she simply didn't care. Either way, Eleanor knew one thing for certain: she would no longer sit quietly and accept disrespect. Whether it came wrapped in a joke or delivered with a smile. 2 weeks passed in relative quiet. Eleanor tended to her garden, attended her book club, and tried not to dwell on the strained lunch with Michael and Vanessa. She'd been careful not to pressure Michael, knowing he was in a difficult position between his wife and his mother. When he called on a crisp Thursday morning, his voice carried a note of hesitation that immediately put her on alert. "Mom, we're having Sunday lunch at our place. Victoria will be there too." He paused. "I'd like you to come, if you're up for it. It'll just be a couple of hours." Eleanor's first instinct was to decline. After their last 2 encounters, the thought of spending more time with Victoria, and by extension, Vanessa, made her stomach knot. But the hope in Michael's voice was unmistakable. He wanted to try again. "I'll be there," she said finally. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather that belied the tension Eleanor felt as she approached Michael and Vanessa's front door. She'd dressed simply in slacks and a sage-green blouse, her silver hair pulled back in its usual neat twist. Vanessa greeted her with a smile that felt a little too bright, ushering her into the living room where Victoria was already seated, sipping tea from one of Vanessa's delicate china cups, and Michael looked relieved when Eleanor arrived, almost as if her presence might help him navigate the afternoon more smoothly. "Eleanor," Victoria acknowledged with a nod, her eyes skimming over Eleanor's outfit in that assessing way she had. "Nice color. Brings out your eyes." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, taking a seat across from her. "How have you been?" "Oh, busy as always," Victoria said with a light laugh. "I was just telling Vanessa about the charity gala I'm organizing. It's for the Children's Hospital, such important work." The conversation flowed along safe channels as they moved to the dining room. They discussed the weather, a new coffee shop that had opened nearby, and some landscaping Michael and Vanessa were planning for their backyard. Eleanor listened, nodded, and even joined in from time to time, determined to maintain her composure regardless of what happened. The meal, a delicious roasted salmon with fresh vegetables, progressed peacefully. For a while, Eleanor dared to hope that perhaps Victoria had taken their last encounter to heart, that maybe this would simply be a pleasant family lunch after all. But as Vanessa began clearing the plates, Victoria leaned toward Eleanor, a smile on her face that was too calculated to be casual. "Well," she began, "still keeping busy with your hobbies." The way she drew out the last word made Eleanor's pulse quicken. She felt the heat rise in her neck. Michael froze for a second, but before he could speak, Vanessa returned from the kitchen and added, "She means the baking and the gardening. You're certainly dedicated to those." She said it sweetly, but the pause before her words and the slight curl of her lip told Eleanor she was fully aware of the double meaning that Eleanor's interests were somehow less worthy, her life smaller than theirs. Eleanor's heart pounded in her ears. She looked at Michael, who was watching her, his expression cautious. He was waiting to see how she would respond. "Yes, I still enjoy them," she managed, keeping her tone neutral. "They've served me well over the years." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "How nice. Some people need bigger things to feel fulfilled, but it's sweet that you're content with the simple things." Michael's jaw clenched visibly, his fist tightening on the table. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm but quiet. Victoria blinked, genuinely surprised. "What?" she asked, feigning innocence. Vanessa's eyes darted between them, her smile fading. "You've made these little comments before," Michael continued, "and I'm asking you to stop. They're not funny, and they're not harmless." The room fell silent. Victoria raised her eyebrows but said nothing, perhaps realizing this wasn't something she could brush off with another joke. Vanessa opened her mouth as if to speak, but Michael turned to her too. "And that goes for you as well. We're not doing this anymore." Eleanor stayed quiet, partly from shock and partly because she didn't want to make the moment about herself. It wasn't like Michael to be so direct, especially with people outside their immediate family circle. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't the same uncomfortable silence Eleanor had felt at the restaurant. This one was heavier, more final. The rest of the meal passed in stilted conversation, everyone choosing their words carefully as if navigating a minefield. When it was finally time to leave, Michael walked Eleanor to the door. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly. This stops now." Eleanor squeezed his hand in silent thanks, too moved for words. As she drove home, she reflected on how different this encounter had been from their previous ones. This time, it hadn't been her who set the boundary. It had been Michael, and that changed everything. What she didn't know then was that his decision to speak up would have ripples far beyond that Sunday lunch, setting the stage for an even more direct confrontation that neither of them could avoid. The call came just a week after the Sunday lunch. Eleanor was in her greenhouse, carefully transplanting seedlings. When her phone rang, seeing Michael's name, she quickly wiped her hands on a towel and answered. "Mom, are you free for dinner tonight? Vanessa and I are going to that new Italian place downtown, and we'd love for you to join us." He sounded more relaxed than he had in weeks, as if the confrontation at Sunday lunch had somehow cleared the air. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before accepting. Perhaps they were finally turning a corner. When she arrived at the restaurant, a cozy, upscale establishment with exposed brick walls and soft lighting, she spotted Michael at a corner table. He waved her over, and as she approached, she realized with a sinking feeling that Victoria was there too, seated beside Vanessa. "Eleanor," Victoria greeted her with a polite nod. "So glad you could join us." Michael shot Eleanor an apologetic look as she took the seat beside him. He hadn't mentioned Victoria would be joining them, and Eleanor wondered if he'd known in advance or if this had been a surprise to him as well. The meal started pleasantly enough. They ordered appetizers to share bruschetta, calamari, a caprese salad, and the conversation flowed along safe topics. Michael talked about a new project at work. Vanessa mentioned a colleague's upcoming wedding. Victoria discussed a recent trip to Santa Fe. Eleanor relaxed slightly, contributing stories about her garden's latest blooms and a fascinating history book she'd been reading. For a while, it seemed as though they might actually have a normal, pleasant family dinner. But as their entrees arrived, Eleanor noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Victoria and Vanessa began exchanging glances, and Victoria's smile took on that sharp edge Eleanor had come to recognize. "You know," Victoria said, swirling her wine, "I was just thinking about people who never really venture out of their comfort zones. My friend Judith is like that, hasn't tried anything new in 20 years. Same vacation spot, same hobbies, same routine." It wasn't aimed directly at Eleanor, but the implication hung in the air. Eleanor took a sip of water, ignoring the bait. Michael noticed. She could see it in the way his eyes darted between them. Victoria continued. "Some people are just too sensitive to enjoy certain social situations. They can't handle different personalities, so they isolate themselves." Vanessa smiled, turned to Eleanor, and said, "Well, if you don't like my mother's sarcastic jokes, you can just pay the bill and leave." The words landed with a weight that silenced the table. Eleanor's fork stopped midair. Michael's head snapped toward his wife, his eyes narrowing with disbelief. Eleanor looked at Vanessa, who was still smiling not nervously, but with that calm, deliberate expression she wore when she thought she had the upper hand. Victoria laughed softly, as if it were all in good fun. Setting her fork down carefully, Eleanor asked, "Is that what you think I should do?" Her tone was quiet, but there was no warmth in it. Vanessa shrugged slightly. "I'm just saying, if my mother's sense of humor isn't for you, you don't have to put up with it." Her voice was light, but the words were meant to sting. Before Eleanor could respond, Michael cut in. "That's enough," he said sharply, his voice stronger than Eleanor had ever heard it in public. "That's not a joke. It's rude." Vanessa's smile vanished, her eyes narrowing. "I'm just being honest. You're overreacting." "No," Michael replied firmly. "I'm not. The two of you have made my mother the butt of your jokes more than once, and I'm done pretending it's okay. It's not." He looked at Victoria, then back at his wife. "You can call it sarcasm or humor all you want, but it's not funny if the other person isn't laughing." The table fell silent. Victoria cleared her throat, muttered something about not meaning any harm, and reached for her wine glass. Vanessa looked away, focusing on her plate. Eleanor sat in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because Michael had said it all. The rest of the meal passed in awkward conversation, everyone careful to avoid anything that might reignite the tension. When the bill came, Michael took it without hesitation, placed his card inside, and handed it back to the waiter without a word. As they stood to leave, he walked beside Eleanor. "You are never going through that again," he told her, his voice low but resolute. Eleanor nodded, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. Relief that he had finally taken a firm stand, and sadness that it had taken so long to reach this point. Outside, the cool evening air felt refreshing after the tense atmosphere of the restaurant. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling as though she could finally exhale after holding her breath for weeks. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: she would never again mistake those smiles for innocence. And if they tried their tactics again, they would find her unwilling to sit silently at the table. The next morning, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her as she stared out at her garden. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind: Vanessa's cutting comment, Michael's firm response, the uncomfortable silence that followed. Her phone rang, breaking her reverie. Michael's name appeared on the screen. "Mom, how are you feeling this morning?" He sounded tired, his voice lacking its usual energy. Eleanor wondered if he'd gotten any sleep at all. "I'm all right," she assured him. "How about you?" A heavy sigh came through the line. "I talked to Vanessa after we got home. It didn't go well." "I'm sorry to hear that," Eleanor said, meaning it. The last thing she wanted was to cause problems in her son's marriage. "Don't be sorry," Michael replied firmly. "She needs to understand how this feels from your perspective. I tried to explain to her how different it feels to be on the receiving end of comments meant to belittle someone. But," he trailed off. "She just doesn't see it that way," Eleanor finished for him. "No, she doesn't. She thinks I'm being overprotective and that you're being too sensitive." Eleanor closed her eyes, absorbing the words. It hurt to hear that Vanessa couldn't or wouldn't recognize the impact of her behavior, but it wasn't surprising. "Michael," she began carefully, "I appreciate you standing up for me, more than you know. But I've been thinking, and I've made a decision." She took a deep breath. "I won't put myself in situations where I know I'll be disrespected. I love seeing you, and I'm happy to spend time with you anytime. But I think it's best if I decline invitations where Victoria will be present, at least until I have some assurance that things will be different." Silence stretched between them. Then, "I understand, Mom. I really do. It wasn't an easy decision." Part of Eleanor wanted to believe that things could change if she just kept showing up. That maybe over time, Victoria and Vanessa would run out of ways to make her the punchline. But another part knew that change rarely comes when those causing harm don't recognize the problem. "Can I ask you something?" Michael's voice pulled her back from her thoughts. "Have you always felt this way around Vanessa, even before Victoria came into the picture?" Eleanor hesitated. She'd never spoken negatively about Vanessa to Michael, not wanting to place him in an impossible position. "Not exactly," she said finally. "Vanessa was always a bit reserved with me. Polite, but distant. I thought it was just her personality. Or maybe she was shy. But looking back, there were small comments here and there, nothing as direct as what we've experienced lately. But little digs about my house, my clothes, my interests. Why didn't you ever say anything?" "What would I have said? Michael, your fiancé doesn't seem to like me." "That wouldn't have been fair to you, or to her. I thought we'd find our way to a better relationship over time." Michael was quiet for a moment. "I think she feels threatened by you." "Mom, threatened by me?" Eleanor couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "Why on earth would she feel that way?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe it's because you and I have always been close. Maybe she's afraid she can't measure up to the kind of mother you've been. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe she's just insecure about her place in my life." Eleanor considered his words. She'd never thought of herself as intimidating, especially not to someone as confident and put together as Vanessa appeared to be. But insecurity often manifests in unexpected ways, and sometimes the people who seem most self-assured are actually the most vulnerable to perceived threats. "That's no excuse for cruelty," Eleanor said softly. "No, it's not," Michael agreed. "And I'm not trying to excuse her behavior. I'm trying to understand it." After they hung up, Eleanor sat for a long time, thinking about boundaries and respect and the complicated emotions that underlie family dynamics. She'd spent decades teaching teenagers about empathy and kindness, but there was something particularly painful about facing unkindness from someone who was supposed to be family. Still, she reminded herself, dignity isn't something you trade for the sake of appearances or even for family harmony. She didn't know when she would see Vanessa and Victoria again, but she knew the next time would be under different circumstances, and if they didn't like the change, that would be their problem, not hers. What she couldn't have predicted was how quickly the opportunity to test her resolution would arrive, and how it would push them all into a confrontation that none of them would walk away from unchanged. 2 weeks passed in relative peace. Eleanor spent her days in her garden, now vibrant with summer blooms, and her evenings with books or occasional dinners with friends from her book club. She spoke with Michael on the phone every few days, but they carefully avoided discussing Vanessa or Victoria. It was a temporary truce. Eleanor knew a pause rather than a resolution. When Michael called on a warm Wednesday afternoon, there was an unusual hesitation in his voice. "Mom, are you sitting down?" Eleanor's heart skipped. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he assured her quickly. "It's just, Victoria wants to meet with you, to apologize." Eleanor nearly dropped her phone. "Apologize, Victoria?" "Yeah, I was surprised too. Vanessa says it was her mother's idea. She wants to clear the air, I guess." Eleanor sat down at her kitchen table, processing this unexpected development. "Do you think she's sincere?" A pause. "I don't know. Mom, Vanessa seems to think so. She said her mom feels bad about how things have gone." Eleanor wasn't convinced. After their previous encounters, it was hard to imagine Victoria feeling remorseful about anything. But she was tired of the tension, tired of walking on eggshells around her own family. "I'll meet with her," she decided. "But not at their house. Somewhere neutral." They agreed on a small coffee shop downtown, a place with enough ambient noise for privacy but public enough to keep things civil. Eleanor arrived early, selecting a table by the window where the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the polished wood. Victoria walked in precisely on time, elegantly dressed as always in a cream silk blouse and tailored pants. Her posture was straight, her face composed in an expression that revealed nothing. She spotted Eleanor and approached, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor," she greeted, sliding into the chair opposite. "Thank you for meeting me." "Victoria," Eleanor nodded. "Would you like some coffee?" After ordering a latte for Victoria, plain black coffee for Eleanor, they sat in awkward silence for a moment, neither quite sure how to begin. Victoria straightened her napkin, then looked up. "Well," she began, folding her hands primly on the table, "I understand there's been some tension lately, and I want to apologize if you took my comments the wrong way." The words landed exactly as Eleanor had feared, not as a genuine apology, but as a subtle redirection of blame. "If you took my comments the wrong way," as if the problem were Eleanor's interpretation rather than Victoria's behavior. "I appreciate you saying that," Eleanor replied carefully, "but I need to be clear that this isn't about me taking things the wrong way. It's about how they were said and how they made me feel." Victoria nodded slowly, her lips curved into a practiced half-smile. "I see," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that I've always been sarcastic. People who know me well understand that. I never mean to hurt anyone." "That may be true," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "But when someone tells you that something hurts, the intent doesn't erase the impact." For the first time, Victoria's smile faded. She looked out the window for a moment before meeting Eleanor's gaze again. "Well, I suppose I can try to be more careful," she said. "But you have to understand I'm not going to change who I am. I've been this way my whole life." There it was again, that subtle refusal to take real responsibility. In that moment, Eleanor realized this meeting wasn't about Victoria fixing anything. It was about checking a box so she could say she tried. "I'm not asking you to change who you are," Eleanor said. "I'm asking for basic respect, the kind you'd show to a colleague or a neighbor, or even a stranger in line at the grocery store." Victoria sipped her latte, her expression unreadable. "You know, Eleanor, Not everyone is going to like everyone else. That's just life. Liking someone and treating them with respect are two different things, Eleanor pointed out. We don't have to be best friends, but as long as we're both in Michael's life, we need to find a way to coexist without hostility. Hostility? Victoria's eyebrows rose. I think that's a bit dramatic. Eleanor took a deep breath, reminding herself of her years handling difficult parent-teacher conferences. What would you call it when someone repeatedly makes belittling comments about another person's life, interests, and choices? Victoria didn't answer directly. Instead, she changed tactics. My daughter loves your son very much, you know. She wants him to be happy. I never doubted that, Eleanor said honestly. And I want Michael to be happy too. That's something we have in common. They finished their coffees with small talk about the weather, local news, and the pastries at the coffee shop. The conversation was cordial but shallow, like tracing paper over a page of unspoken truths. As they stood to leave, Victoria gave Eleanor that same polite smile and said, Well, I'm glad we could talk. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to say much more without revealing the frustration simmering beneath the surface. They walked out together and parted ways in the parking lot. On the drive home, Eleanor thought about how Michael would ask her how it went. She knew she would tell him that Victoria had apologized, but she would also tell him the truth that it wasn't the kind of apology that changes things. It was the kind of apology that keeps the peace on the surface, but leaves the cracks underneath untouched. By the time she got home, Eleanor had made an important decision. She didn't need Victoria to like her or agree with her. She just needed her to understand that there were lines she could not cross without consequences. If that understanding came through a genuine change in behavior, all the better. But if it came from Eleanor walking away when the lines were crossed, then so be it. Michael's invitation to a Sunday barbecue came as a surprise. It had been barely a week since Eleanor's uncomfortable coffee with Victoria, and she hadn't expected another family gathering so soon. Just a casual get-together, he assured her over the phone. A few friends, some neighbors. Victoria will be there, but there will be plenty of other people to talk to. Eleanor hesitated. I don't know. Michael, after everything that's happened. I know, Mom, he interrupted gently. But I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it would be okay. I've talked to Vanessa, and... He paused. I'd really like you to come. There was something in his voice, a quiet plea, a hope that things could be different that Eleanor couldn't ignore. She agreed, but only after reminding herself of the promise she'd made if a line was crossed. She would address it immediately. When she arrived, the backyard was already filled with the tantalizing aroma of grilled chicken and the gentle hum of conversation. Michael stood at the grill, expertly flipping skewers and marinated vegetables. He greeted her with a smile that seemed genuinely relaxed. Vanessa was arranging colorful salads on a long table, her manner polite if somewhat brisk as she welcomed Eleanor. Victoria sat under the shade of a pergola, engaged in animated conversation with one of the neighbors. She looked up as Eleanor approached, gave a brief nod, and returned to her discussion. For the first half hour, everything went smoothly. Eleanor helped set out plates, refilled drinks, and chatted with some of the guests, most of whom she knew from previous gatherings. The atmosphere was pleasant, the food delicious, and Eleanor found herself beginning to relax. But as she joined a small circle discussing gardening tips, she noticed Victoria watching her from across the yard, a calculating look in her eyes. When Victoria approached their group, Eleanor felt a familiar tension creep up her spine. Gardening can be such hard work, one of the neighbors was saying. All that digging and weeding, it's like a full-time job sometimes. Victoria laughed lightly. Well, I suppose if you don't have much else going on, tending to plants keeps you busy. It was almost identical to the comment she'd made months before. For a moment, Eleanor felt that familiar heat in her chest, the instant response of hurt and indignation. But this time, she didn't swallow it. Looking directly at Victoria, she said calmly but clearly, Actually, I have plenty going on. Gardening is something I make time for because it's important to me, and I'd appreciate it if we could keep this conversation respectful. The mood around the table shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but people noticed. Michael paused by the grill, a look on his face that was somewhere between surprised and proud. Vanessa stopped arranging dishes for a second before continuing with renewed focus. Victoria's smile tightened, but she didn't reply. She simply took a sip of her drink and looked away. Eleanor didn't push it further. She had said what needed to be said, and she left it at that. There were no raised voices, no drawn-out arguments, just a clear boundary set in front of others. And it was enough. For the rest of the afternoon, Victoria kept her distance. There were no more backhanded comments or sarcastic jokes. Eleanor wasn't sure if it was because Victoria had taken her words to heart or if she simply didn't want another public moment. But either way, she had made it clear that she was no longer willing to be the silent target. Later, as most of the guests had left and they were cleaning up, Michael came over to Eleanor. "I saw what happened earlier," he said quietly. "You handled that perfectly." Eleanor shrugged, trying to keep her tone light. "I just told the truth. That's all." But inside, she knew it was more than that. It was the first time she had addressed Victoria's behavior in the moment without relying on anyone else to step in. It felt like she had taken back something she hadn't even realized she'd been giving away, her right to stand up for herself without apology. As she was leaving, she passed Victoria, who was gathering her things. The older woman glanced at her briefly and said, "Good to see you." There was no sarcasm in her tone, but there was no warmth either. It was neutral, and for the first time, that felt perfectly fine. Eleanor didn't need Victoria's approval. She just needed her respect. And if that meant Victoria chose her words more carefully around her, then the point had been made. The final test came not long after the barbecue. Eleanor stopped by Michael and Vanessa's house on a Saturday afternoon to drop off some homemade preserves and herbs from her garden that Vanessa had requested. She hadn't planned on staying. Her intention was to leave everything at the door and go, but Michael insisted she come in for a cup of tea before heading home. When she stepped inside, she was surprised to find their living room full of guests. A casual gathering was underway, with about a dozen people scattered around the space, engaged in lively conversation. Victoria was there too, holding court among a small group, her voice carrying easily across the room. She gave Eleanor a brief smile before turning her focus back to her audience. Eleanor sat near Michael, sipping her tea and listening as the guests discussed everything from travel plans to new restaurants in town. For a while, the atmosphere was pleasant and relaxed. Then, as the conversation turned to hobbies, one of the guests, a friendly woman Eleanor hadn't met before, asked her about her gardening. "Michael says you've built quite an impressive garden," the woman said with genuine interest. "I've been trying to grow tomatoes on my balcony, but they never turn out right." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the friendly overture. "It takes practice," she assured the woman. "I started small, too. This year I built a little greenhouse, which I'm quite proud of. It's extended my growing season considerably." That's when Victoria let out a light laugh and said, "Of course, when you have nothing better to do, growing plants is the next best thing." It was almost identical to the comment she'd made at the barbecue, but this time it was in front of people who didn't know their history. Several guests chuckled politely, thinking nothing of it, but Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Before she could even respond, Michael set his cup down on the table with a deliberate thud. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The room fell silent. Even the background chatter from the kitchen seemed to fade. He looked directly at Victoria. "We've talked about this more than once, and it's over." Victoria blinked, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. "I was only joking," she said, forcing a smile. "No," he replied. "You were belittling her. You've done it before, and I am not going to let it slide anymore. My mother has always treated you with respect, and she deserves the same in return. If you can't do that, then you are not welcome here." The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Vanessa opened her mouth, perhaps to intervene, but Michael held up a slight hand in her direction without taking his eyes off Victoria. "I'm serious," he continued. "This is my house, and these are the rules. You will not cross them again." Victoria's expression shifted from surprise to something harder, but she didn't argue. She picked up her coffee and took a slow sip, avoiding his gaze. No one spoke for several seconds, and then the conversation cautiously resumed, though it was clear the energy in the room had changed. Eleanor sat quietly, absorbing the moment. It wasn't just that Michael had defended her, it was that he had done it without hesitation, without waiting to see how others would react. He hadn't softened his words to make them easier to swallow or left any room for misinterpretation. This was no longer about a simple comment. It was about drawing a final, unbreakable line. After the guests left, the house felt strangely quiet. Michael walked Eleanor to the door as he always did, but before she left, he paused. "I meant it," he told her. "You are not going to have to deal with that ever again. Not here, and not anywhere we are together." Eleanor felt emotion well up in her throat, but she managed to smile. "I know," she said, "and I'm proud of you." On the drive home, she thought about all the times she had sat silently through those comments, convincing herself it was better not to make a scene. She thought about the months it had taken for Michael to see the situation clearly and the courage it had taken for him to stand up not just in private, but in front of others. And she realized something important. Sometimes it's not enough to draw your own boundaries. You need someone to stand beside you and defend them with you. That day, Michael had stood beside her without flinching, and from that moment on, she knew she would never have to sit silently at that table again. 3 weeks passed with no contact from Vanessa or Victoria. Eleanor spoke with Michael regularly, but they focused on his work, her garden, books they'd read anything but the confrontation at the gathering. There was an unspoken agreement to let the dust settle before revisiting that territory. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, Eleanor's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. When she answered, the voice on the other end surprised her. "Eleanor, it's Vanessa. I was hoping we could talk." Eleanor sat down, unprepared for this direct approach. Usually, Vanessa communicated through Michael, not directly with her. "Of course," she replied. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, well, I mean," Vanessa hesitated. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day at our house, about how I've behaved, the things I've said and not said." Eleanor waited, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like a carefully prepared speech. "I want to apologize," Vanessa continued. "Not like Mom did, with all those excuses. A real apology." She took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for how I treated you, for letting my mother treat you that way, for not standing up for you. None of it was okay, and you deserved better." The sincerity in her voice caught Eleanor off guard. "Thank you, Vanessa. That means a lot to me." "Michael helped me see things differently," Vanessa admitted. "He asked me how I would feel if someone treated my mother the way I let my mother treat you. It was eye-opening." There was a pause, and then Vanessa added, "I grew up with Mom always talking to people that way. She calls it being real or just joking around. But Michael helped me see it for what it really is, unkindness disguised as humor." "That's a difficult realization," Eleanor said gently, understanding the complexity of Vanessa's position. "Especially when it's about someone you love." "Yeah," Vanessa agreed. "And the truth is, I've always felt like I could never quite measure up to what Mom wanted. She has such high standards, such strong opinions. When I brought Michael home, she immediately started comparing your family to ours, your traditions, your lifestyle, everything. It made me feel, I don't know, defensive, I guess. Like I had to prove our way was better." Eleanor felt a wave of empathy for the younger woman. How many times had she watched her students struggle with the weight of parental expectations? How many times had she counseled them through the painful process of becoming their own person? "That's a heavy burden to carry," she said softly. "It is," Vanessa agreed. "But it doesn't excuse how I behaved. I'm truly sorry." "Eleanor, I appreciate your honesty," Eleanor said, genuinely moved by the vulnerability in Vanessa's voice. "And I'd like us to start fresh, if you're willing." "I'd like that too," Vanessa said, relief evident in her tone. Maybe we could have lunch sometime, just us. No Michael, no Mom. A chance to get to know each other properly." They arranged to meet the following week at a small cafe Eleanor had always liked. As she hung up the phone, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. The lunch with Vanessa was surprisingly pleasant. Without Victoria's presence or the pressure of a formal family gathering, they found common ground in unexpected places. Vanessa's interest in design complemented Eleanor's love of gardens. Both were about creating spaces that nurtured the soul. They discovered a shared appreciation for historical fiction and a mutual dislike of reality television. "I've stopped inviting Mom over as often," Vanessa confided over dessert. "At least until she can show that she's willing to change. Michael was right, there have to be consequences." Eleanor nodded, impressed by Vanessa's resolve. "That couldn't have been an easy decision." "It wasn't," Vanessa admitted. "She's still my mother, and I love her. Yee. But I'm starting to see how much her behavior has shaped mine, and not always for the better." She hesitated, then added, "I don't want to be that person anymore, the one who tears others down to feel secure." As Eleanor drove home that afternoon, she reflected on the journey of the past few months. What had begun as a simple dinner invitation had evolved into a profound lesson about boundaries, respect, and the courage to stand up for oneself and others. The situation with Victoria wasn't fully resolved. That would take time, if it ever happened at all. But something important had shifted within their family dynamic. Lines had been drawn, consequences established, and a new foundation of respect was being built. Eleanor thought about the words she had spoken to countless students over the years. Your dignity is not negotiable, not for approval, not for peace, not even for love. She had lived those words these past months, and in doing so, had not only reclaimed her own dignity, but had helped others find theirs as well. That, she realized, was perhaps the most meaningful harvest from all she had sown.